All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here to the final presentation of the RSN Spring Conferences presented by WPI. I'd like to show everybody just in a few seconds here a great group of people who are going to be doing a roundtable discussion about the end of Bag Day. Lots of great people, so I'll start off by introducing your host for this show, Evan Morrison. With all that said, Evan, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Francis. Welcome, everyone. Super excited to be doing this panel with an amazing group of people. We're going to be kind of reflecting on the first season or half season with no bag and kind of how that impacted our teams, what we observed about it, and thoughts moving forward into 2021, where presumably the bag will not be returning. So with that being said, we'll be talking about with some topics that we've prepared ahead of time, but we also want to hear from you. So for those of you in the chat, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, stuff that you want us to pontificate on, here are our thoughts. Go ahead and put those in chat with exclamation point Q followed by your question. We'll pick that up and insert those as appropriate. And lastly, just want to say a big thank you to WPI, our presenting sponsor. Worcester Polytechnic Institute is also my alma mater and is a leader in project-based education and the first university to offer a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in robotics engineering. To learn more about becoming a student or sponsoring a project, visit wpi.edu. All right, with that being said, I do want to go ahead and have our panel introduce themselves. My name's Evan Morrison. I'm a member of RoboSports Network and also one of the mentors for Team 4911, the Cyber Knights. And we'll go around the horn here, starting with Adrian.
Hey, real quick before Adrian starts, Evan, I wanted to ask, who are the Cyber Knights?
I don't know, some little team from.
Continue.
Washington.
Sorry, I had to put that there. Go ahead, Emerson. Sorry.
From Connecticut. I'm Adrian Emerson. I'm from FRC Team 148, the Robo Wranglers.
Alan Gregory. I'm the head coach for 3847 Spectrum.
Hey, I'm Karthik. I'm an advisor for Team 1114 Symbotics.
I am Tom Bottiglieri. I'm a mentor on Team 254, the Cheese Proofs in San Jose, California.
Hey everybody, I'm Ty Tremblay. I'm a mentor on Team 319, Big Bad Bob out of Alton, New Hampshire.
Awesome. Really esteemed panel, and I think it's super interesting because we've got a mix of teams here that have been very successful at high levels of play and at other levels of play, and who have all taken, I think, some different approaches this season. So really excited to hear what you folks have to say. To kick things off, just what were your general thoughts on how no bag did or didn't impact the 2020 season? I think this is probably the biggest change to the structure of FIRST, or FRC at least, since Alliances in 1999, which I wasn't involved then. I think a few of our guests may have actually gone through that transition. But yeah, so who wants to start off with your thoughts on this, on how no bag went?
I can start it off. I think it's important to, normally we would be doing this at this time of year and we would have actually completed a full season. We'd be looking back at the Houston Championship and kind of seeing the whole effect. But I think this is almost like a mid-season review or a midterm report on how things went, because we know how the traditional build season went and we saw a couple early weeks of competition, but some of us, haven't even competed yet. And so it's hard to truly suss out the effects until you see like the length of the season. So I just kind of want to start off setting the table there. I'm kind of looking at a midterm report.
Yeah, and I think while we are looking at a midterm report, I think with no question whatsoever, the no bag change saved 319's season this year. And so I don't want to start off with like the big bang, but 319 went through a lot of changes. We lost a lot of seniors. We had a lot of changeover in the mentor side of things. So we actually severely overestimated our ability to manufacture and build and design these robots in time, and the ability to cut down to one robot, still use the robot that we had, not having to have it locked in a bag is like what allowed us to remain competitive.
Yeah, that's huge for your team. I know for us on 4911, we had some big plans, and it did not pan out the way that we expected it to. Certainly didn't survive what Infinite Recharge threw at us. Alan, I'm gonna throw it to you here. Spectrum obviously has done a public build season for a very long time, and a blog that's very popular. So I think a lot of teams maybe have seen what your plan was and how that was going. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts were, both on how it affected your team and also how you think your blog is maybe affecting other teams differently than it would have previously, and the kind of resources that you're putting out now that the bag is not part of it.
Absolutely. So one, I would definitely say, I was a big proponent of moving to no bag for a long time, right? I definitely was trying to get rid of the bag for many years, so I was very happy it was gone. We had originally planned as a team not to really change much of our development cycle from previous years. Our plan was to build a practice bot and a competition bot kind of simultaneously and have the same identical builds, with the competition bot normally trailing a couple days to max like a week behind. That was our normal MO. But as we kind of got into the season, we started realizing that we're going to need a much more high quality functional kind of prototype of the shooter to make sure we actually really liked it. And that ended up pushing us all the way to building a prototype robot that we weren't planning on. That was almost like probably about halfway through week 2. We basically decided we needed to build an entire robot. And that prototype robot ended up being the practice robot that we were going to like kind of eventually get to the level of the competition robot-ish, hopefully. And we weren't sure ever if we were even going to get a competition bot ready. And there was like this backup fallback plan that, if we need to, our week 1 event, we could take our practice bot if we had, or like the prototype bot, basically, if we had to. So that whole part was very weird that there were so many different options that we didn't expect to be playing with at all, but we kind of were bouncing around and kind of juggling a little bit. It all did work out. We were able to get a competition robot built. It was mostly white and everything, and we got it painted and everything on time and everything, but it definitely was weirder throughout the season to have so many options where we weren't just like, no, this deadline has to happen. This has to be the wiring deadline on the competition robot. That's when it has to get done. Otherwise it doesn't get in the bag. All of that kind of stuff didn't have to happen this season. I think the biggest thing for us specifically was how much calmer we were going into our first event, because we had actually driven that robot 2 days before, the day before, tested it, knew all the code was right on it, knew everything was okay. We weren't like, normally for an event, we're waiting a couple hours before load in with the bagged robot so we can save every single second we can in venue to be able to work on it. And we just didn't have to do that this year. It was so much calmer. I think we walked in an hour and a half late to the venue. We would never do that in previous seasons. There's no chance. But it was just so much easier and calmer. Even like on the inspection side of things, it was a lot easier to get robots inspected because teams that actually largely were ready to go.
Yeah, that was huge.
So all of that was awesome throughout the season.
I want to riff on that for a second. Hold your thought, Ty. That in general, my observation were the teams were a little bit more ready to go coming into their first event than they would have been with the scramble to get things out of the bag. I actually want to do a quick show of hands among our panel of whether you felt like your robot was done before you got to the event and you'd had a chance to really tweak and tune things up to your liking. Whereas I think almost all of us previously, every single first event, there was something that you were doing as soon as it came out of the bag. Versus those of us who maybe showed up and still had some significant work to do. So if you showed up and felt like you got a chance because there wasn't a bag to get the robot ready to go before you showed up at load-in, just go ahead and raise your hand.
We didn't show up at loaded, so.
Well, okay, Tom, you guys were like what, an hour. You were, you were what, hours away.
We actually have the robot loaded onto the truck, ready to go down to.
Okay, so in its state that it's in, though, you feel like you could walk into an event and you're pretty much ready to just hit inspection and get it going.
For sure, and I think that this was different from years past in that we didn't have big modifications to make to the robot because we didn't have those few weeks where it was kind of locked down.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that we were ready in really confident going into our first event as far as like, hitting that top tier performance that we wanted to get to. But that's going to be true with any, week 2, week 3 competition. But overall, I would say, this was probably the most ready we've been for an event since 2018. So, and even then, that we were pretty ready that year as well. So,
yeah, that's definitely interesting to me because I think a lot of people's concerns with going into no bag was that the deadlines would slip away. You didn't have this sort of semi-artificial stop point, and you didn't have this time to stop and pause and be like, okay, this is what's in the bag. We need to do X, Y, and Z as soon as it comes out and plan for these specific windows. Now, on my team on 4911, we definitely struggled with getting everything ready to go. Our plan fell apart, as I mentioned before, kind of from the beginning of the season. We spent a lot of time recovering, and while we did perform very well at our first event, we did not show up ready. In fact, we actually worked at our home shop up until the 5 o'clock deadline of when load-in starts, and then packed our trailer. We were cutting parts all the way up until the very end. So, yeah, Karthik, you sound like you're wanting to talk about your experience.
Our
there.
experience was very similar to Evan's. This was probably the least prepared we've been for an event ever. It was, we missed a match for the first time ever, and it was some of that was. A lot of it was the sliding deadlines, and I think my perspective is a little bit different because I'm not an on-site mentor anymore, so I'm not there living and breathing and understanding exactly why things were happening the way that they were. But regardless, things slipped in ways that they normally don't on a team. Is it because of the lack of a deadline, or is it just because of overall organizational changes? It's hard to tell. However, the lack of a bag did let us bail ourselves out in that, the last couple nights were like full out all-nighters, full out just go, figure everything out. The fact that we could liberally rip parts off the practice robot and then put them onto the comp bot. The comp bot, it's hard to even call it a comp bot at this point. It was more like a Frankenstein. It was like, let's grab the intake, let's grab the shooter and throw it all together. And not having to do that at the event was like, that's huge. So when we got to the event, we could focus on the traditional stuff that you're doing, which was like, trying to lose some weight, trying to get some things tested, trying to figure out, we're chasing weird can errors, stuff like that. But I think that as everyone looks through this, I think there's definitely a sense, a certain degree of confirmation bias that can come into play, where when you look at how your season was different, I think, if people who thought who wanted to get rid of the bag, it's easy to look at, oh yeah, our season was different and the good stuff happened because of the bag. And the people who didn't want to get rid of the bag will say, oh yeah, our season was different and this bad stuff happened because we got rid of the bag. So it's important to do some proper analysis and try to suss out where the bag was the factor and where it was just every other dependent variable involved in the situation.
I think that's an interesting point.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I think the thing that the bag or the ship date did was it was sort of a forcing function to get your robot to the point where it was almost ready. And in doing that, you start to surface some of the unknowns, right? You're going to build the robot, you're going to put it together. Something you didn't account for is either it's not going to work, it's not going to go together correctly. And if you have that bag day forcing you to get to that point, now you've got a few weeks to plan for that. And I think something that we saw a little bit on our team, and it sounds like maybe, Evan, you had a very similar situation, was that if you move that deadline out to your first event, you lose all of that buffer. So yeah, you had more time and it was a little smoother through it, but really pushing a few weeks beforehand lets you recover in ways that you're not going to be able to now. So that was just an interesting thing that I thought came out of our season.
Adrian, I'd love to hear, because you had the most successful first event of everyone here or anyone in the world, basically. So I'd love to hear how things worked out on 148.
It's really interesting, and I think you guys kind of talking about pushing deadlines. For us, I think the biggest thing that pushing the deadline out to our first event did was we weren't focused on really random stuff that we usually had to focus on when we had the bag. One of those being spare parts. one of the major things we were always doing like the day or two before bag was like building all these spares that we may or may not need because we've got to, put them in the bag, even if it's not the exact one that we're going to have on the robot. It's like if we have a spare of a Rev 2 behind or something and it's in the bag, we don't have to use that we don't have to use our weight to bring it in. And so we were like focused on all these weird things that didn't really matter at the time, except they mattered for this bag deadline. And so I think that's the reason that moving that deadline was really good for us in the fact that we could just focus on the things that actually mattered for our first event, not these kind of things that we had to deal with because of bag. And a good example of that too was like our Wheel of Fortune mechanism, which was, non-existent at Plano. We in previous seasons would have had something on the robot because we knew we wanted it at some point. So we would have put the Rev 1 Wheel of Fortune mechanism on the robot, knowing that maybe it wasn't exactly what we wanted. We would have diverted energy to that in the last few weeks, knowing that we probably weren't going to use it at Plano. And instead, we got to divert all that energy to things that we actually needed for Plano. We got to develop more autonomous time. We got to work out some bugs in our integration. And we got to do different things like that. And so I think that to us was the most beneficial part of not having the bag. And we could just focus on what was the most important thing right now versus what's the most important thing that we have to do to get in the bag. So
it makes a lot of sense. And I want to kind of touch on a point that you just mentioned there, Adrian, that the sort of need to have, because it's got to be on the robot before it goes in the bag versus, we actually are planning to use this at our first event. Now, 4911 went through some pretty major changes in the offseason. This is actually my first year on the team. I was not a mentor for them last year, and we got a new head coach as well. So there was a large change overall. And it's a little hard to detangle what influences were from, what results came from process change and student turnover and that kind of stuff versus having different rules for the bag day. But we actually completely changed our approach for the season. So we went all in on this idea that the robot that we brought to our first two events did not have to be anything similar or even physically share any parts with the robot that we were going to bring to district championship and championship if we qualified. And so the first robot that we were to bring to our first couple events was intended to be essentially a qualifying robot, right? We were going to slap something together and do almost what Alan, you'd mentioned in terms of this protobot. And it was intended to be something that we put together extremely quickly, had up and running and competition viable within the first 4 weeks, not optimized, right? Just done. And something that we could hand off to our software team, hand off to our drive team, and then get started on a robot that took what we learned from that and move on, and plan to have that with all of the bells and whistles later in the season. And so we never ended up building that second robot, and our first robot ended up morphing into having provisions for all of the features anyway. But I'm curious to hear if any of your teams attempted to do something drastically different with your process or your approach based on it, rather than just saying, well, we don't need to put effort into this because we know we don't need it later in the season.
We talked about doing that same thing, Evan. We had a very similar concept. You have your week 1, week 2 robot that you slap together in a few weeks. You take your learnings from that and you use that to build your one that you're going to go compete with at the later level of play. We ultimately decided against it because, at least in this first year, it felt like it was going to be like we were going to be working against ourselves in a way. And these things tend to kind of spread out over time, longer than you think they're going to take. So we ended up going against that. One thing that we did change, though, is we didn't build a third robot. So the past few years, we've built 3 robots, one for the actual competition, one for the drivers to practice with, and then one theoretically for the programmers to use. We often don't finish the last one, but it becomes a proving ground for trying out new sensors, all sorts of stuff like that. This year we just split to 2. And we actually finished our practice robot way before we finished our competition robot. Usually we try to get the competition one done and squared up, and then we'll go back and finish the practice, just so we can get the comp one in the bag. This year, kind of flipped it on its head. We did practice first, got it tuned, and then we slowly brought comp up to the point where the competition robot really only shot its first balls a few days before we were supposed to compete at CVR. But because we had learned so much about how stuff works on the practice robot, we weren't too scared about it coming all together. So overall, it didn't really change much for us, but just a few things in ways that we didn't kind of expected.
So we had a similar idea of doing like this 2 to 3 week robot, but we were going to, our intention was to do it for different reasons, not as like a qualifying robot. But one of the things before this season happened, we sat down and talked about what things we wanted to improve about our team, what things we struggle with, and how can we utilize no bag to maybe help some of those things. So one of the biggest things that we identified was during the season, the things we struggle with the most is usually system integration and actually getting, all these great prototypes that we have together on one machine and actually functioning together really well. And so our main goal, we went into the season wanting to build a 2-week robot, but our main goal with that was to get subsystems done, quick and dirty, and put them all together so we can start solving those system integration problems earlier. And that actually worked out really well for us. Now, our 2-week robot plan turned into a 3-week robot plan, which I think was still really successful for us. And so instead of having the perfect intake or the perfect spindexer or the perfect shooter, we had a robot taking balls from the floor and into the goal at the end of week 3. And that was really beneficial for us in the fact that we could then say, okay, yes, the intake's not perfect, but we know that this geometry is going to get it into the spindexer. So now let's try and solve all these other problems when we know we at least have this one part down. Same thing, we know the spindexer works kind of. We've got to work some kinks out, but at least we know in this configuration can feed into the shooter. And so then we can start to, work and develop. So we kind of switched our process, and where we would normally develop subsystems to perfection and then try to integrate them, we integrated them first and then tried to perfect the subsystems. And I think that it worked out really well for us. And like I said, that was kind of our plan going in, and we were maybe about a week behind what we intended to be before the season. But we got about a week behind after week 2 and stayed about a week behind for the rest of the season. So for us, it seemed pretty successful.
So we took a quite interestingly different approach. Our plan was to build a robot that could evolve over the season, not necessarily to change the robot over the season, but just to build a robot that would have some basic functionality, such as, for example, this year was, it could collect the balls, it could store 5, and it could shoot 5. And then we would add a turret, and then we would add software to pre-stage the balls so that we could shoot faster. And then we would improve the turret code so that we could shoot while on the fly, like 2056 showed off, but was unable to do so on the field, which was so sad. And then that was basically our plan. Was we took an idea of what we wanted to do at championship when we were winning Einstein, and we broke it down into, okay, what's the absolute minimum of that we think can get us a blue banner in week 1, and then how do we iterate every other week from there? And I think it would have worked. We had a pretty fast shooting turreted robot ready to go for week 3 before week 3, got eliminated. Did anyone else try to do that staged approach like that?
It wasn't necessarily a staged approach for us, but I mean, going back to 2014, I think 2014 was the first time where we decided early on in the season that we planned the evolution of our robot. Funny, that robot's name was actually Evolution. But in the past, it's just been okay, stuff happens, you see stuff, you figure stuff out, you know what you're going to do. But that year, we kind of said, around week 2 or week 3, it's okay, we want a goalie stick on this robot, but it's not going to be something that we want to have early on in the season. Number 1, because we don't want anyone to see it. Number 2, we don't just know if we can get it. We just got other bigger things to worry about right now. It's not going to be a big deal. But we decided we wanted to have that at champs. And so ever since then, we've been open to things on our robot, knowing that things on our robot are going to change at some point, and being ready just to use the full time. And we try and stage our events with a gap, so we can ideally compete weeks 2, 4, 7, and 9, and so you always have that room for upgrades. And this year, what happened was, because often, I guess a couple of years ago, in 2018, we had a robot that was bagged that we liked and we were okay with, and then we saw a Swamp Thing robot debut, and we saw how their intake went through the back. It was like, oh, we could easily modify ours to do the same sort of deal. But we knew we couldn't make that change for our first event because it was bagged up and it just wasn't going to happen. So we planned in the change to happen at our second event, use our second event to test it all out so it'll be ready for district championship. Now this year, we had an intake at first and it was whatever. And then we saw Orbit compete in Israel in week 1. And it's like, oh, okay, we can do some stuff. Our geometry is similar to their geometry. We can make those changes. And we got that new intake onto our robot for our week 1 event. So it did allow us to accelerate our phases, but it's not like we had a defined, okay, at this point we'll upgrade our intake, at this point we'll upgrade this and that, whatever. But and after our first event, right away we came back and we had all sorts of planned upgrades that normally probably couldn't have been done till the district championship, but that we were phasing in to get done for Waterloo by possibly changing our spin dexter style to be more like 148s. So
I think that's the biggest thing we missed out on this season, is really seeing how much iteration we could get done. Right, we did a little bit from week 1 to what we were going to have for week 3, just some few minor tweaks, but we definitely had plans going into state champs and stuff, especially a lot of Auton stuff. We didn't have our practice build area until about week 6 of build, so we weren't doing a lot of Auton until after our week 1 event already.
Yeah, and I should speak to software, because our software guys had a plan of, this stuff's only going to get implemented at this point in the season. This stuff's going to get implemented for DCMP, and hopefully, like the shoot on the run stuff was like a championship type level thing until we saw 2056 do it before their first event.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, sure. We sort of do the same stuff where we stage features, and we had a plan baked out for this year. Our first event, we were going to have some of the software stuff, like all the shooting on the fly. We actually designed our robot to do that as well, kind of from the ground up. We just hadn't gotten there yet. We had a buddy climb that we were working on that we were going to have for our first event. And we were going to bring that on for a later one, potentially, if we wanted it. I think it's interesting to see, though, that I think I'm the only person on this panel whose team was not part of the district system this year. So we only had our 2 events and then straight to championships, right? So you can't, for us, the cost of not being totally ready for any one event, I think, is much higher. And I think for any team who's not participating in a district style system, I think, Ty, you said you were going to compete, 2, 4, 7, and world championships. That gives you it gives you much more time to kind of break those things out and weigh where you want to add all of this effort. And it makes the cost of showing up not as ready a little easier to bear. But yeah, it's just, I wish we had districts. That'd be cool.
Yeah. I mean,
Sorry, Adrian, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, we have the same conversations where, especially, I use our Wheel of Fortune mechanism because that's the thing that didn't make it on the robot this year for Plano. But we would have those discussions okay, well, we're definitely going to need it for states. And so we got to have it on by states, but we don't want to be trying it out for the first time at states, which means we really have to have it for Dallas. And then if you really have to have it for Dallas, well, Dallas is only 2 weeks after Plano. And really, because of the way our scheduler worked out, it was not really even 2 weeks. It was only a week and a half. And so it's okay, well, if we don't have it for Plano, then we only have a week and a half to get it ready for Dallas if we're not working on it before then. And so, it in districts, you do play more times, but you have less time in your shop. So it does kind of accelerate all that development for, back as well. And so we would have those discussions all the time. And for us, it's you need everything for states, because states for us was much more competitive, I think, than our Worlds division last year, just in terms of the depth and the abilities of the teams. And so it's you're trying to get everything ready for state champs, but it's, for us at least, it's during week 6, right? So it's like you have to have everything done before that, and it is like really stressful. You don't want to be trying anything out there for the first time.
I think it's important for us to mention that there's a lot of teams in first, and I think it's still about like 35 to 40% who only compete at one event. And so their season is one event and hopefully get to the championship. But that hopefully gets to the championship means that they have to like be on their game at that one event. So the liberties that teams like ours who are in district systems or who are pre-qualified for the championship, where you can you don't have to hit the gas fully at the beginning of the season. A lot of teams aren't in that position where that event is make or break, and also that event could be the 8 matches that they get for the entire season. So it's
right, but
perspective is important to remember.
Right, but I think no bag helped in that aspect. In that, as all of our teams said, we all felt slightly more ready to go when we got onto the field. Our robot may not have been as ironed out as we had expected, but it was slightly less stressful. We were more together, and I think that could have happened with that 30 to 40% that only got that one event.
Oh yeah! Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that bag was bad for them. I'm just saying that their perspective on how to set up a build season is going to be a little bit different.
Right.
Like I think for them, it's just great because they got more time with their robot. Because if you're only going to compete once and you're limited to only having access to your robot for 6 weeks, like it's better to have access to your robot for 10 weeks beforehand. There's more learning experiences and more inspiration that are going to happen inside your shop.
Right.
Did you have something to add there?
My point was basically Karthik's, especially that the teams competing once, if they do it a little bit later in the season, get to see so much more of other teams competing and actually potentially get to go practice somewhere, have a scrimmage somewhere. There's so many opportunities you can do with no bag. That was one of the things we got to do was we didn't have our practice field. Basically, we never had a practice field at our home. We had a goal that we could shoot into, but we didn't get carpet down or anything until basically after our week 1 event. So before that, we went to Paradox 5414's place to practice with them with our competition robot, which is not something we could have done before, right? We did it the Tuesday before our week 1 event where it would have been in the bag before, but instead we were on somebody else's practice field, driving it around, practicing, which was a huge help for us.
And I actually want to touch on that a little bit because, for us in the Pacific Northwest, up in the north end of Seattle, there's the North End Field that 2522 Royals puts together. And it's just a fabulous facility. They have an Andy Mark field border. They really went all out this year on making it, real truss and everything. And that field was packed constantly from like week 5 of build season, with teams that normally either wouldn't be able to do that because they only build one robot, or teams that only could do that until bag day. Because they only built one robot. And so that was definitely just outside of competition, a noticeable increase in the number of teams that had, and they were willing to bring maybe not even fully ready robots to the field just to try it because they could afford the time at that point in the season because there wasn't this looming, deadline that they had to have everything ready for a couple weeks before their event to get in the bag. So that was definitely an observation that we had, and I imagine that that's fairly similar for community fields like that elsewhere. I know the Robodrome in Ontario that Caltex and a couple other teams have there. I expect that was probably a little bit busier, as well as I don't know. There's countless of these around the country. One thing that I want to try and maybe transition a little bit to a discussion of, we started touching on modifying the robot, implementing new things over the season, and there's a risk associated with that as well. And I'm gonna throw it to Adrian here because a couple of years ago, when you were still in the regional system, Robo Wranglers went through a major robot transformation, and when we were still in the bag era, that was a massive undertaking that only a team with the kind of resources like Robo Wranglers, I know 558 had done it a couple times, really ever attempted. And now we're in an era where, a team can go to their first event, maybe it's a regional, maybe they do surprisingly well for themselves, or not surprisingly, maybe they expect it, but They end up with a bid to championships via wild card or something, and now they've got a whole bunch of time with their robot. What are some of your thoughts on teams, how teams are approaching this now, both from a perspective of some of us here that are used to iterating on our robots over the season, and maybe some gotchas for teams that didn't necessarily get to do it this season, but maybe looking at ways that they can start making more large-scale changes to their robots in the future.
Yeah, I kind of had like PTSD a little bit when you brought that up. In contrast, so 2017 was probably the most stressful season I had on 148, and 2020 was probably the least stressful season I've had on 148. We were very relaxed. The no bag really helped us kind of like slow things down, calm things down. But thinking about doing that when you can do all of those changes in your shop on your terms, where you know where the tools are, you can have all your people, you can have multiple tables. It like becomes so much less intimidating. Now it still takes an extreme amount of resources. You need time, you need parts, you need the financial ability to be able to, and manufacturing ability to be able to make all that to redo your whole robot. So it's still a huge undertaking, and I'm sure, and I hope that some of teams would have taken advantage of that, so we could have seen it this year. And it's a shame that we didn't. But I wouldn't say it was the most fun thing we ever did, and I don't know that we would do it again if we could go back. But you do have a lot more opportunities now, and I think that during that season we saw the writing on the wall a lot sooner than we were able to actually respond to it, because we had to put the robot in a bag, and we couldn't work on it between competitions. And so I don't think that we ever would have gotten to that point if we didn't have a bag. I think we would have been able to change things. One of the big things with bag is it's like we always had to have the most current version of everything, every subsystem, like on the robot when we put it in the bag, or on the practice robot before it took the field. And I think that this change allowed us to like not be so picky about that almost. It's like, okay, if we can take off the most current version of the intake or whatever, we just put on an old version for now, and keep working and keep practicing or whatever, because we can just put it back on later. It's not this constant like, okay, which version of this is on which robot and where do we need it to be? Does it have to go in the bag? Does it have to go on the comp bot? Where is that supposed to be? And this year it's like, okay, put this here, put that there. And I think in 2017 it would have changed our whole season, not just that rebuild. We would have been able to get ahead way faster. But I'm excited to see teams kind of go through that process if they're able to, or if they, just see pretty clearly, in the first, before competitions, it's like, okay, this robot isn't going to make it. Okay, what do we have to change to get there? But they're not going to miss out on their whole first competition. Maybe they have something that's functioning that can go out and take the field, like you guys were talking about earlier, and you kind of have your other robot on the back burner or something.
One thing that I noticed, and I can't wait till we go through a full season of this, just to see how this really plays out. But coming into the changes, or as the changes were being discussed, one talking point that was brought up a lot was, it's like, oh well, so many teams are just going to copy other teams, and we're going to have like a lot of design similarity by the championship. And then there was a lot of people who were like, no, that's just not possible with the scale of FRC. And from what I saw in the first couple of weeks and from talking to teams, no, it's definitely possible within the scale of FRC with the abilities of teams. And like, I'm not saying that this is something that people need to be concerned about, because I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think that our reality is going to be is that robots that do really, really well early on in the season are going to be emulated, and stuff that they've done is going to be copied, especially if there's more teams who are doing open builds this year, who are doing cool stuff in their open builds. Like I thought, obviously, we have Alan and Ty on here, but I thought 6328 published a lot of crazy cool stuff as well. And I think that teams are going to see some of that stuff and be like, well, yeah, like we've got like 4 weeks until our next event now. Like, why don't we throw some of that stuff on? Why don't we try and make these changes? We can, like 4 weeks is like plenty of time to do that sort of stuff. If you already have like a solid drivetrain to work from. So I've become more convinced that the whole of it's just too complicated to copy another FRC robot and is not necessarily a thing. Because I also found there was a lot of teams this year who are really, really good, who were copying cool ideas from teams who might not have been able to execute them at a 10 out of 10 level. And I think those teams would have hit them at a 10 out of 10 level. And that's an interesting side effect of things, where in the past, the only teams that could do these huge makeovers would be 148 in 2017 or 254 in 2015.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
It's been
I can see where you're coming from. It's interesting to think that I was actually thinking the exact opposite of what you were thinking, in that, yes, there's going to be some elements from other teams that get copied, but I don't think I've ever seen a copy of a whole robot that ends up being better than the original.
I think in 2015, I thought 254 copied distinct elements from 1114, and then were better than us by the end of the year. Completely were.
So taking elements.
Yeah.
Just copied it.
Taking elements and taking an
Literally,
entire
it was like a
robot,
screenshot
though.
from my CAD that I sent to Corey.
That's a good idea. We should do that. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem, guys.
I think the
Seen
big
this
thing
for a
is
few years now. You know,
having
like
open elements is very different than having entire robots, though, right? So, there's not many teams. We all saw a 148's robot. There's not many teams who can build 148's robot and compete anywhere close to that level if they're starting from nothing, right? There are teams who had a working spindexer and could take elements of their spindexer and make their robot better. I don't think there's a lot of teams who can just start from, we had a totally different thing. Let's build this in 3 weeks and get it ready for champs, and it's going to be performing that well and have enough time to do auto and have enough time to tune.
Yeah, but
all of those things.
But Alan, 148 competed week 1. That gives teams who are going to North champs week 2.
Yeah.
Sure,
8 weeks. 8 weeks. And I'm not saying they have to build a whole new robot, but I'm saying that a team who didn't have a spindexter, who is above average quality team, could copy a spindexter in 8 weeks. If they can't,
We had a lot of discussion about this because our spindexer was very, very, very simple. And so we discussed this a lot. Do we not let people take pictures of our robot? We thought about this. And at the end of the day, we said the same thing. If you didn't already have a spindexer on your robot, you really have to design your entire robot integration around that subsystem. And that's hard. And again, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of manufacturing. And I don't know how many teams are going to go out and do that big of a change. And I wish we could have seen that. We have no idea. But a team with a spindexer that already had that, in their robot could have easily taken, the elements of magic in our spindexer, because I think ours was pretty good, the one we put on the field in Plano, and they definitely could have replicated that very, very, very easily, and I'm sure that a lot of teams would have.
And if yours went anything like ours, though, I think you're selling yourself a little short, Adrian, because when we did a spinning ball spindexer, I guess you call it, as well, and the amount of time we spent designing the actual spinning thing and the motor to spin it and how to put the balls in was very little compared to the amount of time we had to spend making sure it didn't jam, doing all the integration work. The devil really is in the details, and the integration is really hard if you want to get that robot to be tiny and do all that stuff, right? But it's going to be hard to just take it and jam it into another.
Yeah, but here's the thing. A team doesn't need to be at hit 148's level for their season to become more successful because of what they've done. If you hit 60% of 148's level, for a lot of teams, that's going to be considerably more successful than what they're going to have. Sure. And I think there definitely would have been a lot of teams who tried to copy elements of other teams only to end up with failed copies showing up at champs, or not necessarily failed copies, but something that's just less efficient, and it's going to jam every 3 matches, or it's going to have those issues from the integration or whatever. But I guess my whole thought on this is that I think that teams are, it's this apple that you want to grab at, because it's I can improve my robot, and Mike Corsetto talked about this in his presentation this morning. I talked about this in my presentation yesterday. It's like teams don't necessarily understand where their limitations are at. And so it's like, yeah, I'm going to go for that. And something's going to show up at championship. And I just think that before I was of the thought of, no, FRC robots are just too complicated and too expensive to try and do these sorts of things. But I think teams are going to try. And then maybe it would have taken a full season of teams failing at it and not hitting the levels they wanted and being like, man, I wish we had just stuck with our original robot. But
I think that's one of the big things. This team has to look at the risk, right? So our Spectrum was known for this for a while. 15 to 17, the robot we put in the bag at the end of build season looked nothing like the robot we competed with at Champs. We were constantly improving. The 15 robot, the bagged robot, literally never touched the field. We destroyed the entire thing, built a whole new robot at Arkansas. That was not great, but it was better than the thing we bagged. And there's a lot of risk involved, and there's a ton of work involved. I mean, we're getting an FRC robot done in 6 weeks is very hard. Getting it done while you're competing at other events in 8 weeks, whatever going on, it's still really difficult, right? Like, they are really complex. And I think the biggest thing is a lot of people thought, the argument that I heard a lot with No Bag was, oh no, the best teams in the world will just copy the best team in the world. And that's where I don't think that's going to ever happen, right? Like, it's way easier. If you didn't miss the mark by a mile, you don't need to build a whole new robot.
Mm-hmm. And maybe the Spindexer was like an unfortunate choice of example for something like that, because it takes such a large amount of space of your robot and it has to be so integrated. I think a good example of design convergence could be something from like 2018, where Spectrum posted a great video of their claw collecting robots with collecting cubes with different durometer wheels. We saw it, copied it, took it, iterated. It ended up being outperforming Spectrum. So then Spectrum ended up, taking our design, and we just iterated back and forth through the whole season. And then because we've got two robots with open designs being successful with collectors, then all of a sudden that starts propagating, and you start seeing this Spectrum collector almost everywhere in 2018. So I think like Karthik, I think you're right in that we're going to have this design convergence, but I think it's going to be more from like the discrete parts of the robot, and not like 21-22 Team Taters copying 254's 2018 robot verbatim.
Yeah, that's by far the most dramatic. Like, I mean, we've already seen intake design convergence the last 2 years heavily. 2018, there was that one picture of all these California teams with the same intake. It was like very confusing. And then the same thing with like the wheel sucker.
We definitely came up with it first. That was
of course. Always do. A copy can never be better than the original.
That's the dirty little secret. It's just something really good, and
then make it better, right? Well, I think it's kind of interesting because you've got two things here, right? One is the example of the 2018 Spectrum Bob intake evolution, right? And the number of teams that took that design and ran with it, or just copied it directly and used it successfully. That level of iteration, I think, is now accessible to a larger number of teams, because even though they don't have the resources to do a full-scale robot overhaul, you've now got a lot more time to implement something like that, to figure out how to build it, to tweak it, etc. Right? The other thing that I think has happened is a little bit of what Karthik was talking about, which is that the bar that has to be met in terms of complexity to actually be feasible for any team to pull it off is much higher or lower, I guess, depending on how you look at it, right? But like the complexity of mechanisms that can be not will be, right, not are easy to, but can be successfully integrated into a robot over the course of a season has gone up. And I do echo on the Spindexer level that I think we would have seen a number of teams attempt to integrate or overhaul their robots to implement a Spindexer of some kind. Whether or not they would have been successful at doing it, I think a larger number of teams would have considered or attempted it because the time is there to do so.
Well, and I think there's a discussion point that's been coming up in our community in different forms. There's, basically just kind of like there's like a bijection between all of them that are very similar. Where years ago, when Robot in 3 Days first started, a lot of people were like, "Oh, this is bad for the community because now like teams have to make a choice of, do I use my own idea or do I copy what I've seen from Robot in 3 days?" And then the great elevators and shooters stuff came out. And it's the same thing. It's like people are like, "Well, I want to use my own shooter, but I'm hurting myself by not doing that." And now next year there's going to be that same sort of argument. It's like, yeah, teams are being forced to copy what they see that's really effective in weeks 1 or 2. Otherwise, they're hurting themselves and that sort of thing. And so I think as a community, we have to kind of figure out, or maybe we don't have to figure it out as a community, maybe we just have to figure out on our individual teams, like what we're comfortable with and what we're okay with. Like my thought on this all is it's just like, yeah, I'm cool with all of it. Like I just, people want to see our robot and take detailed pictures and copy stuff from it. More power to you. We'll show you. Like we'll pose for the angles, we'll set up the light, we'll make a TikTok for you, like whatever. But I know there's other people who aren't going to be comfortable with this, and like there's going to be some teams out there. We might go back to the pre-1999 era, or I mean, some teams were doing this in 2012 where they put a barbecue cover over top of their robot so no one could take pictures of it and stuff like that. And I don't know where any of this is going to go, but there's like different paths because I think people have strong feelings on this in different ways.
As aside, Karthik, I hope that we get in the future a TikTok where someone sees a really good robot and copies it, and it's the flip the switch meme.
Hey, this is your director, Francis O'Rourke, right over here, real quick. I'm looking at Ty, and I'm feeling the same way Ty is. What is that exactly? I have no idea what you're talking about. What's a TikTok?
Yeah.
Is that a thing you do on Facebook?
You're actually talking like on air right now, Francis. I couldn't tell if that was like the director like giving us instructions.
Oh no, sorry. No,
you
this
didn't
is
use your Mrs. Doubtfire voice. It's all
This is our director
handle right
speaking.
there.
Yeah, like I actually understood none of that. Like TikTok and the flip the switch meme.
Leave it to the kids.
Someone who's like 14, can you explain that in chat to Ty, please?
I don't think I would do it justice if I tried.
Yeah.
So, like this idea of, I'm really still stuck. Sorry, I'm kind of reversing a little bit here, but this idea that teams who competed early in the season, or even really later in the season, weeks 4, 5, 6, even, who qualify for champs, who kind of really didn't have a plan past that. In previous years, it's just like, oh, cool, we qualified. I guess we'll put this thing in a box and then see it for 4 weeks,
Yeah.
Right? And now, it would have been really interesting to see it. I guess hopefully we'll be able to see this next year. If the game evolves in a like really significant way between your late week regionals and the championship events, because now these teams are like, hey, I didn't climb at my event and I was picked as a second pick, and I did this thing and I put I picked up the balls, I put them in the low goal, but now I have enough time to put a climber on my robot or something like that, right? Stuff that maybe would have been a little too hard. Like I hadn't really thought about that, and that's pretty cool.
Well, I have a story to tell, and then I'll come over to you, Adrian, real quick. But so 4911's third alliance partner at our second district event at West Valley was 6076 Mustang Mechanica, and they've built Mechanim kitbot drivetrains, or I'm not sure if they've always been kitbot, but they built Mechanim drivetrains for the past several seasons. They're fairly comfortable with it, and we were talking to them after the event, and they'd actually purchased some swerve modules from Swerve Drive Specialties, and up until literally a couple days before the event had those on their robot and had been planning to run Swerve, but they were still having a few issues with it. So they switched back to a drivetrain that they were familiar with, comfortable with, and knew how to run, ran it for the event, ended up being a phenomenal partner, won the event with us, and then they were like, yeah, and we're going to go back to our shop and try those Swerve again because we want it for the end of the season because we feel it will make us better. And the whole rest of the robot was an every bot, right? Like straight up every bot. But that was just an interesting thing that like I'd never even considered, right? And it's like this is a team that they didn't have the capability to make the Swerve modules, but they could buy them. And they had the ability to make this very last-minute pivot away from that drivetrain that wasn't working and get it into a configuration that they could run their first event with. but they were still focused on, we think that this is the robot that we want to build, and we're going to continue to work on that towards as we get towards the end of the season. Now, they're in the district system, so they didn't necessarily have that. We won the event, we put it in a box, and we go. But that, I think that same kind of mentality, not that I necessarily recommend doing a swerve implementation if you haven't done it in the off season and aren't familiar with it, but just the idea that that's something that a team would be able to and comfortable doing, I thought was really interesting. So
my mind is just blown that a team switched from Swerve to McManum back to Swerve in the middle of the season, and that we had a Swerve every bot. I don't understand that for
I want the Swerve every bot so much.
Hey, this is Francis.
Awesome third robot. That's amazing.
This is Francis, not the director. May I instead suggest just put the mechanism wheels on your Swerve drive, and we actually have a legitimate Swerve Econom robot.
No.
This is like someone showing up with like a Hermes belt but like just like in this like ghetto like $15 suit. It's very confusing to me.
Karthik, why do you keep saying things I have to Google?
If they'd gotten the Swerve to work, they would have been quite good. This is a robot that probably would have been a reasonable partner at a district championship level.
Unfortunately, though, isn't that what you can say about almost every Swerve? Like, if they had gotten it to work, they would have been reasonably good.
It's what you put on the top also matters.
Alonzo Mourning.gif at this point.
All right. Before we went on that tangent, A-Train, you had something to say. I don't know if you still remember what it is.
When we were talking about like the difference in evolution of like a spin dexter and having to change your robot for that, or like the intake where you can in 2018 where you kind of like iterate it very quickly and you could implement it kind of not really, it wasn't dependent on the rest of your robot, but I think like this is really game dependent for me. And I started thinking like every year there's like some challenge that's part of the game or some element of the game that like, if you can do it, you go from being, reasonable to like a really, really strong offensive robot, and it changes year to year, and it's like there's some bit of magic, right? And so the reason I use the spin dexter as kind of our example for what we were talking about, people potentially changing their robot for or taking a lot of elements of our design. And the reason I use that as an example was because one, it was relatively easy to implement in one scenario, but could be potentially really difficult for a team to implement if they hadn't been looking at it since the beginning of the season. But the other reason I used it is because that was like kind of where the magic in the game was this year. Like if you could get your game elements in your robot and through the shooter without jamming, like that was the magic this year. That's anybody that was shooting balls, that's what they spent most of their time trying to fix and solve.
What are you talking about, Adrian? The top priority for any team should have been their shooter, and that's all that matters in the game, right? It's a shooting game. Dude, shoot it up. Figure out the rest later.
Yeah, exactly.
You just put a turret on a Swerve drive and you're fine.
Yeah. Just turn on Swerve drive, and nothing could go wrong in that scenario.
Shooter's gonna shoot, man.
Yeah. But, and in 2018, and it was kind of similar with the intake where like picking up a cube and taking it to where you wanted it to go and placing it there. Like if you could not drop the cube and put it where you wanted it to go, like that was pretty magic. Like you were going to be really successful if you could do that. And so I think like this whole design convergence and people potentially like redoing their whole robot mid-season, I think is really going to depend on what the challenge is that year. And I'm not talking about the game in general, but what are the little tiny challenges that are like that you don't see right on the surface. And so, 1 year that may be really easy to, look at, say, oh, we missed that. Let's put it on a robot because we can just slap it on there. And it's going to be really easy. And other years, it might be really difficult to change mid-season. So.
I do think this, though, and I think this is something that, Jared from 254 talks about a lot, in that FRC is becoming more and more of a software challenge than a hardware challenge. Mm-hmm. And as there's more readily available open source designs, and now you can see robots compete to get ideas, but like you can't see software. And I think so much of the integration, like the really high-end integration right now that's happening, is teams are doing really cool stuff with software to automate things and make this stuff happen. And I think that that's where the challenge is going to evolve to, where sure, there may be like a higher baseline now of mechanical competency because of 18 different factors, and now out of bag being like the 19th factor to go with that. But I think it really lends itself to, like, teams are always going to try and find an edge somewhere. And where are you going to get that edge right now? It's software.
Yeah, for sure.
So we
And
went
I
through
think
this
that's
this
really
year.
interesting. Sorry, I'll go to you in a sec, Tom. But I think that's really interesting because for so long, the mindset was that FRC was primarily a mechanical challenge, right? That that all of the great software in the world wouldn't do you any good because the mechanical stuff was where all the money was. And now that floor is coming up significantly, then the software becomes where the advantages lie. I do think that's a very interesting perspective. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so we actually had this conversation many times this year, sort of looking at our robot and the feature set that we had and looking at some of the other ones out there. And like, well, how are we any better than this other team, this other set of teams? And the answer always just came back to hopefully we integrated it better, hopefully it's more consistent, and the software. Right. So for us, really, and I think you're totally right. We are going to start. We've already seen this, and it's just going to continue to get more and more so a software competition. And hopefully we'll have enough tools out there. There's a lot of people contributing. Our team does this, but a lot of teams have taken what we've written and ran with it or contributed their own things out there in the open source community that people can use for their robots. But the thing is, you can't just take this stuff and slap it into the robot. You really need to spend the amount of time to learn how it works and how to tune it and how to get it all working, right? So I think we'll end up seeing a lot of teams focus more of their time on that. Like, for example, we did a couple prototypes of a shooter this year. We built one up earlier in the year. We made a space claim for it, and we were like, great, we'll have a shooter on the robot, whatever. Like, change it here, this way, that way. And like the big effort went towards integration and making sure that everything was spec'd correctly so that we could like hit the levels we wanted, knowing what we could do with software, right? And I think that people just don't really think that way, at least a majority of teams, And I'm not really sure that that's going to change for your, as you were saying before, the 30-40% of teams that do one competition or two competitions and that's it. Like, I don't think they're really going to. I don't see that really changing for that kind of team, right? Like, so I hope that people can start to build more reliable systems more easily, and if being able to copy from other teams helps that, if having more access to your robot helps that, so that then we can move on to doing more software. I think that's great because it's much more accessible. It's a lot easier to get a bunch of kids a laptop and start trying things out than it is to go, build this $1,000 piece of machinery, right? So,
I mean, and obviously the season didn't end the way that any of us expected or wanted it to. But speaking from my perspective, and I know other teams are doing this right now. Our robot is at our software mentor's house right now, and the software team is still meeting. And they're still developing stuff for that robot, and they just deploy it to the robot, and they're able to run it and meet over, Zoom or Skype or Discord or what have you. So, that's something that I think is kind of wild in one sense, but also just the ability of teams to make those software improvements. When you have, and it's kind of weird to say when you have access to a robot, because a lot of teams don't have access to the robot right now. But if you are able to get access to your robot, or someone is able to, we can't go into our shop, right? We can't make new stuff, but we are still improving our robot. And that's pretty cool. I know, we were a one robot team this year. We had plans to build a second one, but we only built one, and but our software team got a significant amount of time with it, despite how much our schedule slipped. And the amount that they were able to do with that time was extremely impressive. And so that's something that I think a lot of teams may be starting to experience that they didn't before, because it was always a rush to just get the stuff together and put it in the bag. And if you didn't have another robot like that you could develop software on, you were just kind of hoping that the stuff that you did was going to compile and run, and you were debugging at competition. So we're about halfway through our panel talk right now. I think it's been some amazing discussion. I do just want to remind our viewers, if you have questions, go ahead and put !Q and type your question in chat. I'll ask our director, Francis, if maybe we have a couple questions that we have queued up that we can take here from our audience right now, and then we'll see where that takes us.
Sure, this is Director Francis here. We'll have a question here. This is from a user that I cannot pronounce the name of them. It's just some characters, but I apologize to you, sir, or ma'am, or whoever. They ask, did No Bag change what competitions you decided to attend and how?
All right,
Yes.
That's an interesting question. Yes,
Yeah.
from Ty. Okay, elaborate.
For the worst. So in 2016, 319, we went and competed and we did really well. And we were just kind of outclassed when we got to the district champs and world champ side of things. So then in 2017, we're like, cool, we're going to try and build the robot that 254 would build and we'll win the world championship and it'll be great. We actually ended up getting really close, but we went to a week 1 competition and we said, okay, and we just got wrecked because we just weren't ready. So after that, we're like, we're never going to go to a week 1 again. And then as soon as No Bag hits, we're like, cool, we'll build a robot in 4 weeks. We'll be really simple. We'll build like a 2016 robot and we'll just go in, we'll just take the blue banner and run away and go build the real robot after that. So we signed up for this week 1 and then like the classic project problems happen and schedules slip and we show up and we just got trounced because we weren't ready again. So when No Bag came around, we really thought that we could take that extra week and just get ready. And really what ended up happening is we took that extra week to just catch up.
We were really excited about signing up for later regionals because when you have the bag locking down your robot, you need to make sure you have a certain amount of time between your events so that you can, you basically need to factor in the amount of time it's going to take you to change stuff at events, right? So you need to build the robot, bag it, think about what changes you're going to make them, bring those in, do the change on the actual robot, so on and so forth, right? So we were like, oh, if we push our events out later in the season, we can make the changes during the week between the events. No big deal. We don't need to factor in this time it's going to take. That's going to hamstring us. At your second event, you don't want to be spending all Thursday working on your robot and get no practice, right? In reality, because we are in California, you kind of just have to take what you get in terms of events. So we still ended up doing the same schedule as we normally do, like a week 3 and a week 6. But it would be cool to kind of push stuff out in the future if we get the option to do that.
The biggest thing that it changed for us is we typically will try and do a really close event and then one that is in a different region than ours because we like to see different teams and see different strategies and see different robots. But for us, we didn't want to sacrifice travel time now that we could work on our robot all the time. And so we chose to attend 2 very, very local events. And we were luckily able to get into them because we didn't want to have an extra day added on the front and back a lot of times of our events where we didn't have access to our robot because we weren't in our shop. So that's the biggest thing it changed for us is that we tried to stay really local when possible.
Yeah, we stayed with the same schedule this year. We were just like, we're going to do everything the same, and everything was focused around making sure we could get into Waterloo week 4, and so we wanted to do weeks 2, 4, and 7. And now, thinking about what next season would be like, I think even if we want to go to a specific event like Waterloo and it's week 4, we might just say no. Like weeks 3, 5, 7 is ideal because we keep the 2-week spacing, but we start as late as possible to keep the 2-week spacing, and that helps us with our early on development. But at the same time, I still think priorities like getting to events where lots of our parents and team members and community can see our robot is still going to be an overwhelming priority as opposed to trying to set up this ideal spacing.
For us, we like the early event. We like the spacing more than anything else. Like we'll try whatever we can to not have 2 events back to back, and having to play 2 inside of basically 4 weeks to do that means we're either playing 1, 2, and 4 or 2 and 4 or 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 is pretty much our only real schedules. But week 1 is great because if we know we can go in and be ready, then you can hopefully get some teams that haven't played yet. You know, you don't get the disadvantage of having to possibly play against teams who already have a competition under their belt. So week 1 works out well for us, so we didn't really change anything.
I'm so like week one is terrifying to me. The idea that someone would willingly sign up for a week 1 competition just blows my mind.
Tom, this is Francis again. Can I blow your mind even more here? So on my team, we decided to intentionally go to an event week 1, week 2, and week 3 because of this.
That's crazy.
But the intent. So we're lucky that we're in a position where we're going to the championship every year, and so we basically said, all right, step 1. If we don't go to a week 1 event, we will not have a robot for whatever event we go to. We have to have like a set build season, right? And 2, we wanted to get some practice in and out of the way, and then be able to do whatever improvements or changes to our robot we wanted to make for the next 6 or 7 weeks afterward at basically our own schedule.
So you've got like build season A, try it. Build
season B.
Yeah, optional build season B. Yes.
But the other thing with week 1 is, Tom, like if you get done like in a proper schedule and like you nail it, your week 1 event is like nap time. There's no other way of describing it. Like when you come in with a robot that is fully working and ready in week 1, it's homicide. You're just going out there with like your lightsaber and you're just killing younglings. And it's like, yeah, I'm just gonna kill. They're all dead now, so I'm just gonna kill.
Our week 1 this year was the most relaxed event we've ever had.
Yeah.
Even though our drivetrain was even like messing up, and we were still winning matches with like on 4 wheels. Like it was weird. Like
because teams are just, and maybe it's gonna change as out of bag helps teams get a little bit more prepared for week 1. But like sometimes week 1, it's just like, you put your robot on the field and your human player just like falls over. It's like, oh yeah, won the match. Like, hey, we moved off the initiation line. Good job, everyone. Clap, clap. Like it's it's the flip side. But if you're not ready, then week 1's like the most stressful thing ever because it's just like
we had no practice matches at our week 1 this year because they were dealing with field stuff the whole time. So like we weren't even like worried about it. Normally I'm like trying to like, can we help? Can we get to where we can get practice matches? This year it was just like, we're fine. We'll be fine.
Because the flip side is if you're not ready, you're the youngling that's just getting slaughtered by Jedi who are just like bah, bah.
Yeah, I think in the last since maybe 2012, we've been ready twice at our first event.
I thought you were going to say -3.
Yeah, we're always sort of ready, right? Like we get something on the field, and usually it does pretty okay. But there's been 2 times, 2014 and 2018, where we just came out and just like take the robot out of the box or the bag, put it on the field, adjust something, done, right? So I could totally see why week 1 would be really cool for that, but it's just the risks so high, because all those other years it's not going to be a fun time. So I have super high amounts of respect for people who are willing to put themselves through that. It sounds like
I think it's also a lot easier in districts too, where there's less on the line, right? Like if we made it to semis, we were like, it's fine. Like
Right. I was just gonna say that. I think the benchmark for a lot of district teams is if you're making it to semis at your 2 events as a captain or a first round pick, you're going to pretty much have enough points to go to your district championship. And that's kind of all that matters, is just get to the district championship and then be competitive there if you're trying to qualify for Worlds. Now, obviously, blue banners are really nice, but it's not the same level of you better be ready to play or, one of your 2 chances to qualify for Worlds is gone. I do want to ask about third place a little bit for those of us in the district system. Sorry, Tom, but there was a lot of debate.
Dude doesn't even know about first place this year. Like,
ooh, savage.
What?
There was a lot of debate. I think I don't know how public if it was or if it was mostly internal to teams. But do you or don't you go to a third play now that there's no bag? One of the big advantages used to be it was more time with your robot, right, with your competition robot. So I know for 4911 we were signed up for a third play. We still felt that the even with access to a full practice field very nearby, that the extra on competition field time was worthwhile, especially for our drive team. But I'm not sure that same sentiment is shared. So what were you guys' thoughts? And previously did you do third place?
I'll be bold. I'll be the bold one. 148 will never do a third district event ever. It is more valuable for us to be in our shop with our robot than be at a competition. And we were pretty adamant about that even last year. We stopped doing 3 regionals. We only did it like 2012. 2013, 2014 maybe, and it was just murder. It was torturous. You're always traveling, like you never have time in the shop to like catch your breath. But even last year when we went into the district system, there were a few teams in our district that went to like a regional as well, and specifically 118 comes to mind because we talked to them about it, and they said it was just terrible, especially for South Champs districts, because our district championship is sooner and our world championship is sooner, and especially us being in the situation where we host a district event at our high school that we choose not to compete in. If we did 3 plays and hosted a district, that would be 4 out of the 5 weekends before district championship that we were either competing or hosting. And that is just way too much. That is something we will never do.
And just forgetting about the robot access time and all that, like people need to go to work, kids need to go to school, they need to do homework, they need to study, they just need to sleep. Like these events are absolutely exhausting. It's not normal to like just go like from 7 a.m. to like 10 p.m. like for consecutive days or whatever. Like I know like we're used to that in that first sort of mentality, but like it's just not actually healthy, and especially when you're dealing with teenagers. And like it's just like, an extra week off is just way more valuable, where you can take things leisurely at your shop. You can come in, practice for a couple hours a day, turn on some webcasts, and go from there.
Yeah, one of the cadences that 319's been running since 18 was weeks 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So we would just be competing every other week, and then either iterating or practicing, on the in-between weeks. But because it's an engineering challenge, and because we're always finding things we can improve on the robot, it's very rarely practicing and almost always iterating. So then you're almost locked into going to three competitions so that you can get drive time so that you're ready for district championships. So one of the things that really got driven home when this whole COVID-319, sorry. When this whole COVID-19
You don't
thing
want
happened,
that moniker.
You don't want that.
was just like the convenience of having a weekend where it wasn't critical. You didn't have to go and win a blue banner, and then you didn't have to either like prep to try and win a blue banner the next weekend. So I think 319 is going to be changing that for 2021.
We were signed up. A third play without district championships. So.
Yeah, we were signed up for 3 this year, but only because we were trying to play in week 3. We normally would have only been at week 4.
That's a special circumstance, though.
In general, I strongly agree with Adrian. We will only be doing our 2 events, state champs and worlds, just because it's so hard in South to pack everything in, and I just back-to-backs just drain everyone, and your week after everything is just slow after that.
Well, yeah, we even find with the 1 week gap, it's still like time just flies. Where I was talking to our lead design mentor the other day, and he's just like, honestly, I don't know if we would have gotten any of our upgrades done for Waterloo. Like people were very burnt from the preparation for Humber, our week 2 event. So like to get all this stuff ready for week 4, like we had big goals and all, but even with access to the robot, like at the end of the day, there's still only X number of people on the team, and there's only so much machine time, and there's only so much actual time. So that doesn't change.
This changes in a world where you qualify based on your last 2 events and not on your first 2 events, right? But that is not the world we live in. So.
For anyone that's actually tried to iterate in between events that are like have a weekend in between, it's really difficult. Like the amount of, you have to come out of your event and you get no rest time, right? You have to hit the ground running and basically just go in order to, because you get 1 weekend and a couple of weekdays, right? And then you're packing up your trailer to head out again. And so it's it's very difficult. And so I appreciate the teams that are saying we're going to space out our events, whether it's we're going to do 2 events with a weekend in between, but we're only going to practice there and then plan to iterate before in the 2 or 3 week break before our next event. Or it seems a lot more sane to me. I think that's, and of course is not what we tried to do this year. But so, and on that note, kind of what does your experience this year? And Ty kind of touched on it a little bit. Are there changes that you maybe not necessarily confirmed, because obviously not everybody's had their debrief with their teams or talked about what next season looks like, because who knows what actually is going to happen with this season at this point? But are there things that your team has talked about in process of maybe changing for the next season, stuff that you've learned from your experience with No Bag that were really eye-opening?
I think it's not out of the realm of possibilities that 11-14 only builds 1 robot going forward. I think that there's various reasons tied in with this. I think a lot to do with like our current state of the economy and this stuff like that. But I think we saw that we could probably get away with 1 robot if we're disciplined with it and we maintain it really well. It's going to take a lot of dedication to making sure that robot, at the end of each practice session, that you schedule in a couple hours where like maybe even a new set of kids comes in who's not exhausted from practice to do tune-ups, to do checks, to do all that sort of stuff. But I think 1 robot, when this change happened, we were very much like, no, like you still need 2 robots. You still need to split up practice programming or whatever, or maybe more like 1 competition robot and 1 robot that Tom described, which was like a almost built up robot that can be used for development of software type things. But I think that's I'm not necessarily sure that we're going to end up making that change, but it's definitely something we're going to consider.
We this year, and we've done this in the past, but we really tried to lean into it this year, had a robot that was sort of a Frankenstein of previous year's drive. We had a previous year's drivetrain, and on top of that, we had a prototype shooter and a bunch of wood holding it together. And there wasn't even like an active mechanism to intake the balls. Like a kid would have to walk over and like stick the ball into the little tunnel thing, right? And then but that actually unlocked our software students to go start building turret tracking and getting the autonomous driving working. So then when we got to the point where we had a competition robot, we just dropped all that code in and just worked. I know 125 does this as well, where they have their competition robot and then they have another robot which is sort of piecemealed together out of other parts from other robots, but it allows you to unlock doing the software. And I think that's a model that might help a lot of teams, because a lot of times you have a drive base from the previous year that's not doing anything for you, and if you could start to do that kind of stuff and strap different prototypes onto it, maybe you can get away with just building that 1 robot,
This idea that you don't need an identical robot because the one of them's locked away, and that for your basic development you can get away with having a hodgepodge, Frankenstein robot that's got the basic functionalities of prototypes or whatever, and then the final tuning you just do on the real one because it's right there. That's something that I think.
If you're tuning a shooter wheel or something, why does it matter if it's tightly integrated into a system with an intake and a serializer, right? Like all that matters is that you can put a control loop on the wheel and use the right materials, right?
Like our autonomous modes this year, like for our robot literally was not completed until like they loaded it into the trailer to go to Humber, but the auto modes were done just with a drivetrain that went around that could have balls in it but couldn't actually shoot them. And so it's like, we just like the software people that did the paths and everything, and it's just like, hopefully this is gonna score 7 balls and not, and it did. So it's like you can do a lot of stuff where we were in this mode where it's like you need to have 2 exact robots, and if they're not the same, everything's wasted because you have to retune everything. But it's like that's a little bit dramatic.
Yeah, well, especially for No Bag now, because you can tune it and then just kind of put it on the field, and you don't have to worry about trying to swap it out and unbag.
The big thing for us is our prototype robot was pretty close to identical. Like we did all the test fit on it, but it was all done out of wood, and then we made the actual one out of metal and polycarb. So there was a ton of wood brackets and stuff. Like there was box tubing or aluminum tubing and stuff on it too, but there was so much of it done just real quick, but was good enough that we could run on the practice spot for a long time until we needed to get something that was actually able to compete in FRC.
Right. Well, I think from the flip side, from previous years, I've been on teams that have attempted to build shooters before, and the practice robot shooter was not identical to the one that was on the competition robot, and it actually was to the point where we couldn't even, it wasn't worth trying to tune the practice robot shooter because it was just the fit wasn't the same, the part quality wasn't the same, it just didn't behave the same, and across multiple teams and multiple seasons, and that's something that I think is stuck in our minds a little bit, of how beneficial it can be to just have the real thing and have access to it, and that when you get to competition, that the one that you've been tuning in your shop is the one that's shooting into the real goal, and not have to be like all right, well, let's see what we need to tune on this one, and spend literally all of practice day retuning your shooter because the practice robot wasn't the same.
Being able to run auto modes on the competition robot the day or 2 days before we went to an event, like with all of the changes into it, and just like seeing the balls go in was like, oh my god.
It's that level of confidence, right? It's that level of confidence that you're watching the real thing do what you designed it to do. I think that's super, super powerful. I want to spend, we're getting up on the end of our time. I do want to take a few more chat questions, but I do want to just spend a little bit of time on the rules, right? And there was a lot of focus when the rules came out put on how they were going to operate, what kind of loopholes teams may or may not exploit. Obviously, we didn't have the full season, so we don't know if any of the doom and gloom may have come to fruition. But I just want to get your perspective on how the rules that were written that we had to operate under for this first season of No Bag performed. How effective were they, and did we run into any problems with it? I think from my perspective, we didn't really have any issues overall, and we didn't really experience any issues with other teams, but obviously that's just the perspective that we had.
Perspective, we got to compete at one event, and I was LRI at a second, and it was very smooth through both of those experiences.
And just a reminder for folks, the big rules changes, besides just the general no bag, right? The rules that went along with that were the weight change, right? You had this configurations option, the 150 pounds and 125 pound separate limits for what you could get inspected versus what you could go out on the field with, and then no limit on spares and stuff that you could bring in. And then there was this concept of major mechanisms, which I'm still not fully sure is actually really tied to no bag or not. It seems like most of the other rules would function without it, but sort of this concept of teams need to build their own robot now that the bag limitation is gone.
Yeah, I think
Ty.
one of the basically our team kind of got into this idea that, okay, we understand the rules, but how do we work between and through the rules to still build two robots and still build the robot that we want to use, and work as long as we want to and still have it all legal in the end. And when the major mechanism rules came out and the spares rules came out, I was still in that mindset of thinking, how do I kind of lawyer these rules to make them be competitive advantages for me? And as I went through the season, and as I went through the build season and 2 weeks of competition, it just kind of became a matter of like, I don't need to, and I don't want to. I had enough of freedom to do what I wanted with my robot that I didn't want to spend the effort trying to develop some sort of cheesecake climber or a second spare robot to put in the pit or something like that.
Well, this is like so. It was so funny to me. They came out with the no, unlimited spares rule in 148. If you've ever been to our pit, we have like 700 spares of parts that like aren't even on the robot anymore. We just like go overboard. It's crazy how many spares we have in the pit. But when they took away the bag, they took away all that stress of having to have all those spares, like not count against your withholding and all that stuff. And we came into Plano with the least amount of spares we ever had in the year where we could have had the most. It was like almost like the rules of no bag and the rules of spares like almost offset each other in this weird way where like, oh, you can bring unlimited, but now it was like not even almost necessary that you had as many as you wanted.
Well,
it was a really weird
before
thing.
You had to plan for every contingency and get it in the bag at the end of the 6 weeks, and now it's like, oh well, we know what we reasonably need for spares, and we don't, and it's fine. We don't need to put 7 intakes in the bag.
Yeah, it was a weird rule change for this year, but
it's like saying you need to live for the next year, and you can put some amount of money into a bank account, and you have to live off that for a year, or just live. Like you're almost certainly going to put much more and have like understand to like be able to like if you think you don't have runway, right? So
Alan, you mentioned you were an LRI. Did you run into any issues with major mechanisms or teams trying to put mechanisms on other robots that maybe they didn't build or whatever this was?
Our events, no, but I did definitely get a lot of questions to me throughout the season about what is and isn't a major mechanism stuff. So I do think there were going, just like you didn't really see a lot of cheesecake in most years in week 1 of competition season anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So we were going to really see it at the district championships and world championships to see is somebody, right? If you really need that climber somehow on your third robot that you don't have at a district championship or something, right?
This is one of those sets of rules where it's not going to be relevant until someone pushes the boundary, and it's not going to become a thing until someone pushes the boundary in a very visible case, like the number 1 seed at a championship division. That's when people will start to pay attention. And like right now, it's just like, but I honestly, I thought this rule set is good. I hope they kind of just run it back because I just don't think we have enough information to be making changes. And I think that it was a good start. They definitely came up with a good starting point, and I like the general direction of things, how they've gone, and so I just say run it back and then review once you have 1.5 seasons worth of data points. Go through, like, do some real true focus group testing, not just like put a survey out and whoever responds, like establish tiers of teams and grab them and say, okay, we need you to do this or whatever, and if you have to give them a grant to make them do it, then you do it. But like where you're like do some like real focus group studies to try and figure this out, because I find that one of the things that drove me crazy about the whole discussion about no bag, it was just all anecdotal. It was just everyone talking about their own experiences and what they've seen, and with their own preconceived biases. And it's just like I actually don't know how this is affecting the whole community. I know what this group thinks, but we're not a random sample of anything. So like I want to know how these teams are doing. Like the question of, did people end up putting in more hours or less hours, or the same amount but just stretched, and those sorts of things to find out. Because I think that as much as we like to talk about this through the lens of how is it going to affect the competition, is it raising the bar, is it lowering the bar, there is a real aspect to participant health that's important to me, both mental health and physical health. And I've just, like, are we overtaxing people, or did we find a way that we're actually making this program less intensive and still it's easier on people's physical and mental health? And then it's like, yeah, then we've done something great here. But you can't find that out without doing like detailed investigation.
And I think especially with the situation that we're currently in, it's going to be hard to evaluate any of that for this season, because I'm not burned out at all, because we only got 2 weeks of events, right? And I don't know that I would have said the same had we been able to carry this all the way through the championship.
I guess the question is, Evan, were you burnt out at the deadline, like when the cut happened?
Oh, at when bag day was?
No, I mean like when the season was canceled.
Oh, at the end.
Were you feeling burnt out?
That's a really hard question for me to answer because it was like months ago.
Yeah.
And so for me personally, this was a very interesting season because of the team change. and coming from 5803 Apex Robotics, joining 4911 Cyberknights, that they're very different teams. And
Yeah,
so
one of them's in Connecticut.
Hey, Evan, real quick, I just want to say that your wife says yes, you were burned out.
So
my wife is the
I
head
trust
coach
her on
of
that
4911 Cyberknights, so that may also be an impact. She took a new job as well with that. But I think Cyberknights this year I spent a lot more time than I have in previous years, but the impression that I got from the rest of the Cyberknights is that it was less time than they had spent in previous years. So I think there's a little bit of give and take. That was my personal.
Well,
I would
for-
love. Oh, Adrian, please.
I was gonna say, and like obviously, I mean, what Karthik says really resonated. Like, you can't, my data point does not represent all of her. All of ours does not represent the whole. But for me, I've been on the Robo Wranglers. This was my 11th season, so I've seen a lot of different stuff. This was the most relaxed build season we have ever had by far, and in our opinion, this was the best robot our team has ever built. And so when you
bought that
combine,
RC drive.
you just buy the drivetrain. It makes it so easy. But I'm sure there were a lot of other factors. I mean, you can ask anybody on 148. I did not want to build the swerve drive, and I was probably the only one. But whatever, that's a totally different story. But but for us, relaxed gave us a better robot. There were a lot of different factors, but I believe that the no bag was the biggest factor in those two things coming together.
I would love for us to get to a point in FRC where being burnt out isn't normalized, where it's no longer a badge of courage of like, oh, I worked this many hours, I pulled this many all-nighters, and like we've all been there. Like when we were younger, like, we would talk like this, and it was just like, oh, I put in this many, or like I catted all day at work, and I didn't do any real work. It's like I would love it to be normalized where like you can have a healthy, competitive FRC season while not burning out and while still being able to, like, for the students in this program, I want them to still be able to play a varsity sport or be in the chess club or do whatever they want to do. And for the mentors in this program, I want you to be able to go and like have dinner with your husband and like do normal sorts of things while doing this program. And I think that Out of Bag has the potential to maybe take us in that direction. I don't know if it's going to, like, I don't know, but maybe. And so like that's why
it has way more potential than the other system.
Yep. Well, maybe and maybe not though, because at least before, like, the argument that people will say is like there was a cutoff. So like, hey, in like March I can go because I don't have anything to do. I don't know. But I don't know what the answer is, but I'm glad we're trying something because the old system wasn't working.
No.
Not for this incredibly small subset of teams that's on this panel.
March was worse. Like,
Well, I think Ty touched on it a little bit before, but 319 leveraged the option this season, and I believe it was a mid-build season decision to not build two robots.
Yeah.
Right, and that's something that would have been just almost a non-option for a team that's looking at the kind of goals that 319 is looking for to make a decision like that mid-season. It's like, no, we have to figure out a way to build two, and that may have ended up in a different robot that 319 built because of the importance of being able to build a practice and a competition. So
or at the very least, significantly less hair on my part.
and we haven't talked about the other element to all this, the money involved. If you're not building a second robot or if you're not building a third robot, like that's for some teams that's like tens of thousands of dollars. Like it's just absolutely enormous. And the flip side, like Evan, you were saying that like the Ty's team, like they made the decision to go down from 2 to 1, but there's plenty of teams every year where they're not going to get done in time, so they end up having to build a second robot. They just bag what they have and they start building something else so they can actually get some programming and testing done. So like that's money going out of the system. Like I want to normalize, I want to get rid of burnout and whatever like that. I also want to lower the costs in this program so we can be more accessible. Like we love this program. We know the impact that this program has on us and it has on the students. Like, but we can't get that in the hands of more people at the current cost structure. So if costs for teams and like reduce the ways, like this is great stuff. Like I don't know if this is actually happening or we're going to set off a different arms race or something, but like I just want to see it. I'm open to this. I'm glad they made this change. Roll it back and let's have a real
I'm
season.
all about the laziness arms race. Race to who can do the least. That's we actually. So I wanted to chime in about this. We did have a fair amount of burnout on our team this year, even though we didn't even compete. Right? We were ramping up to compete, and because of the no bag, we really missed that sprint towards the bag, which lets you have that little bit of time for, kind of reflecting on what you need to do and maybe taking a little break. There was just no break. It was just right on through. So we had a few people who were kind of really getting to the end of their candle, if you will. For me, it actually worked out great because I do most of the work during the competition season, so I kind of went from relaxed to really relaxed. So no problem there. I do think that we should spend more time as a community and as an organization thinking about these things, and anything we can do to decrease the amount of burnout that people are going through, I think is important, both for just the health of the people in the program now, but also for the health of the program going forward. Like we have people who are mentors of teams and have spent a lot of time growing the program, but after a while, 10 years of running yourself into the ground in a row, it's just like eventually you're just gonna quit. It just becomes not worth it at a certain point. So I think for the health of the program, that's absolutely a great thing to bring up.
Well, we're shortly coming up on the end of our panel discussion here. I do want to take an opportunity to get a couple more questions from chat in here before we close out. Francis, what do you have for us?
Yeah, all right. So this question coming to us from Steph Morrison, and she asks, at Emerson, so you're saying everyone should put a turret on a swerve drive and have the easiest build season ever?
Correlation right there, right?
That is a correlation.
Flip it.
I wish I could go back and record the conversations where we all convinced ourselves I think there was an actual meeting where JVN said, well, I mean, yesterday I would have told you a turret on a swerve drive is dumb, but today, I think that's what we need. And I don't know, we all just kind of looked at each other like, okay. But no, man, I will tell you this, our team, besides me, I really am the Lone Ranger here, was 100% behind every single element of our robot this year. And I will not admit that I was maybe wrong is not the correct term, but
it was not as doom as you
it was
anticipated.
Not, yeah.
I thought going into this
game
season,
through the end of the year.
Yeah.
I thought that going into
who could have beaten
season, this was going to be the swerve revolution, but I think that 2021, man, now especially that it's just like, oh yeah, you just buy RC swerve, stick it on the rope, swerve's going to be everywhere.
Yep. Yeah.
You mean your robot can't go sideways?
I actually have a less Mimi question from Stephanie as well, though. This question is specifically targeted toward Tom, and other people can answer in the same vein. Tom, did you or your team decide not to build two different robots before kickoff, or was the type of game / robot part of robot design you chose? Was that part of the decision to go with only one?
A little bit of both. It was one of those things where it was an idea that we had, and we talked about what it would take to do that. And before the season, we kind of decided that it's going to actually end up being much more work, and it might not be worth it. And then when we saw the game, we looked at some of the elements of it, and there really wasn't anything that we hadn't done before, save, for the Wheel of Fortune thing, but that, whatever. So that really drove home the decision to do it in the way that we do.
Just to before you leave, Tom, can I ask you? You at one point mentioned that you put a Falcon on a really dumb place on your robot. Was that the Wheel of Fortune driver?
There wasn't a mechanism. We had a Falcon on every single mechanism. We didn't use any motors that weren't.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
So the Wheel of Fortune was a Falcon. The hood on our shooter was a Falcon. Hey man, they're great motors.
And I
All
assume
Falcon everything.
Yeah, I assume you bought a quantity of Hella, so it's fine. We'll do.
Somebody else takes care of that.
All right, so we got one final question here. This is coming from JB987, and I'm gonna put his question up on the board. I'm gonna kind of spin it a little bit. He asked, "Do you think the extra time to perfect programming with access to actual compbot is likely a huge benefit of no bag?" I'm gonna kind of spin that a little bit and say, "Do you think it's the extra time for mechanical or the extra time for controls that's going to be the biggest, that you think would be the biggest change for the no bag season?"
We were hoping for the controls time for sure. That was our big push, was get the robot ready for week 1 mechanically, and then just get autos for 6 weeks going into World Championship.
Same.
Yeah. I see 2021 and further becoming this incredible arms race of software where what you see as a successful auto in week 1 and week 2 is almost, come competitive teams in district champs and champs becomes the minimum that you do at that level. And because it's just because you have access to those robots.
I think that this is really dependent on the team. There's teams, remember, there's still teams out there that struggle to get a mechanically done robot out there, and so for them, they're just going to be like, yeah, absolutely, it's the mechanical that's going to be way more valuable. But for teams who are normally getting their mechanical done, or like getting it done by the end of the season or whatever, like the end of the competition season, so then it's going to be the programming where they can really have some more time on that sort of stuff. So I don't think it's there's like a hard rule on that. I think at the top end, it's definitely going to be software, but I don't know where that midpoint exists of where that switches, where it's going to be at the 75 percentile and above that it's software, or the 33rd percentile and above it's software. I don't know.
I think you're going to also get a significant number of teams that transition across that point, whatever it is, that go from teams that have only ever programmed their robot or tuned it at a competition because nothing was ready before that, to now actually having a couple days at least of time to get a few things running before their event.
Also, there's a new bottleneck now. So the bottleneck before used to be the bag. The bottleneck now is access to a full field or a half field. That's what the bottleneck is for teams, because there's going to be teams who now have their robot, but they don't actually have a large patch of carpet to drive on, or they don't have like a goal to simulate with. So I think it's important that I would love to see that if field design could simplify a little bit over the next few years, so it's more accessible for teams to be able to build accurate structures. I thought this year, for example, like it was very, very difficult for teams to build something that pivoted to test the balancing side of things. So I was, we keep eliminating barriers. So like we find it, and there's a new bottleneck. So now we're identifying a new bottleneck. So hopefully that some steps can be made in that direction. And I still think we can have very, very cool FRC games with simpler fields.
Yeah, I think this year also, with just the sheer amount of space needed, if you were going to do try and program a multi-ball autonomous mode, was massive, right, compared to some previous games. I mean, like 2018 is kind of similar in that sense, where you really needed at least a full field's width plus some depth in order to accurately have your robot traverse, like just have enough space for the robot to traverse that. And most, I would say a large number of teams don't have a space that big that has carpet, whether it's, a gymnasium in their school or whatever, to do that. So that's a unique factor that's not even related to the specific field elements, but just the allowed options in autonomous mode, which I personally was extremely excited about, what high level match autonomous modes were going to look like, and just kind of the chess matches that could happen there. But the flip side of that is there's a large number of teams that just can't practice or tune those.
And this isn't something that can only be solved by HQ. We as a community can solve this as well. As if you have access to a practice field, do what you can within your school board or whatever regulations to open it up to allow others to come in. And if there's shared costs that need to happen, then let's make the shared costs happen. But let's find a way to get more teams to be able to practice. Like you talked about it, you have one in the PNW area, like 1114's got a field here. We got the Robodrome in Hamilton. There's a lot of stuff going on, but that can help. Like it's still not going to solve the issues that a rural team has, who's an hour away from the closest other team, let alone practice field. But it's another bottleneck. Let's just keep slashing through these boundaries.
Yeah, for sure.
So for a follow-up question for the software or hardware, now we don't have the final answer. Do we think that we would have seen more on the fly or less on the fly shooting if the bag still existed?
Less.
Yeah, less.
Probably. The people who do it have practice robots. So going back to that software thing, though, I think there's a couple of tiers of teams here. You have a tier of team who really takes software seriously, and that sort of team is almost at a disadvantage. Like they didn't actually go down in their abilities. It's just everybody else is going to be able to move up, right? So, like they were already building the two robots, whatever. They already were thinking about software. They were already doing this stuff, right? So those teams actually become like almost disadvantaged. Then we were talking about, does it benefit mechanical or software? I think there's a big tier of teams where you're going to see huge software gains because they were done with their mechanical stuff that works great, and they just don't have access to a robot or but now if they can take it out of the bag, they can do those things. And I think that's you're going to have a big share in the middle. And I think you have another tier where the programmers were going to get 20 minutes with the robot, no matter if they had 6 weeks or 12 weeks, right? So I think it will be cool to see that big group in the middle be able to start experiment more with software. We'll be able to see more, multi-game piece routines and autonomous mode and that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't expect to see, every team in first be able to start doing great things in auto, almost immediately, right? It's just not gonna.
I have one last very quick question to answer here. This also comes from Steph Morrison, and this one's a follow-up from what Tom was talking about earlier. Steph wants to know, is going sideways still a waste of time, Tom?
So,
bombshell.
Sure.
No, answer is not required. It's okay.
It's not. You're always with the swerve drive. You can think of it. You're always going forward.
Yeah.
That was a legitimate problem on our team this year.
What's your reference frame?
Hey,
If your reference frame is the wheel, you're always going forward.
Ooh, all right. Checkmate.
All right.
Here.
Well, we're gonna wrap it out here. I'll throw it back to Francis. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone on the panel: Alan, Emerson, Karthik, Ty, Tom, for coming on and chatting about this. I'm sure we could continue on for another hour, but we are at the end. Hopefully, all of you watching got something out of this. Really appreciate your questions, and thanks again to WPI for helping us put on these conferences.
Yeah, and hey, before we end for the day, I just want to say a few thank yous. First off, thank you to everybody on the panel for being here today. You guys killed it. I loved talking with all of you, so thank you, Evan, Emerson, Alan, Karthik, Tom, and Ty for taking the time out of your day to be here. And of course, thank you to all of the other presenters that presented over the last 5 days. We had over 20 different people show up, take the time out of their days, and give some great information. For those of you who've been wondering, we've got all of these presentations are going to go up onto YouTube once they're done. So everything up until today is already uploaded. The rest of it will be there tonight. So you can look forward to seeing that shortly. But I also want to say a few more thanks. I want to thank to the rest of the RSN crew, especially Steph and Ruth, who were behind the scenes, who did stuff for me, like working on the overlays, reaching out to people, getting people to sign up, and Ty as well for reaching out to people to get people to come talk at these seminars. I want to also say a big thanks to my compatriot Colleen Shaver. She was behind the scenes all weekend long, picking questions out of chat, acting as WPI Robotics in the Twitch chat. And of course, a big thanks to WPI for helping to make this whole thing possible. It was a lot of fun. I'm kind of exhausted, but it was great. It gave me a great filler exhaustion for the championship that I didn't get to go to, or the 3 champs I didn't get to go to. So I look forward to hopefully we all look forward to doing this at some point in the future. But until then, I hope everybody has a great rest of their day, a great rest of the week, and I hope everybody stays safe until we get to play with robots once more. But for everybody here at RSN, I'm Francis O'Rourke, and thank you guys so much for everything you've done. See you later.